All right. We are, in fact, live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Highlands to Islands. Today we'll be talking a bit about Irish whiskey. The whole idea here is that we wanted to set up a comparative series where we look at the similarities and differences between Scotch whiskey and several other iconic global whiskey styles, including, but not limited to, last week's discussion was about bourbon with our friend Ariel Jean from Woodinville Whiskey. That was a lot of fun. This week, we'll be talking Irish whiskey with our friend and colleague, Martin Duffy from Glencairn Crystal Company. And next week, we've got a really cool Canadian whiskey discussion coming up as well with I want to say it's the Pernod Ricard Canadian whiskey guy. Is that right? And I'm drawing a blank as to what his name is, but that'll be a lot of fun as well. We had ambitions of doing Japanese whiskey segment and Indian whiskey segment. The year is running out. Unfortunately, we're just going to run out of time before we get a chance to do those. Possibly in 2021, you will see that. You will see that happening. Hey, Catherine, good to see you. But for now, we're sticking around the idea of Scotch whiskey and Irish whiskey. Well, what I think, Cam, what I find interesting about this whole aspect of the relationship, I've always found it interesting, the relationship between Irish whiskey and Scottish whiskey in terms of the evolution of the idea, the migration of barley-based whiskey production coming from most historical indicators. Indicate that the idea came from Ireland to Scotland, probably through Islay, to be fair, in terms of the flow of that information from one place to another. So it's very interesting that each of them had a kind of a background in. You're getting some props on your new hairdo from Catherine here. I'm just going to throw that up on the screen. So congratulations on your new coif. It's looking very. It's very, very neat, very tidy, very lovely.
I appreciate it. Sorry, I realized I was on mute there. I apologize.
Oh, right on. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you very much. I was going to say, you can absolutely actually see, on a good day, you can see Ireland from Islay. So legend has it that story of barley-based distillation did, come from Ireland, migrate its way across Ireland, the other Hebridean islands, before striking mainland Scotland. So I think that those two styles of whiskey share more in common than they don't. There are some obvious glaring differences that I'm pretty excited to be able to discuss in today's episode. And Thank you for the compliments on the hair.
So today, our guest, who has just now joined us, his name is Martin Duffy. He's a good friend. He's a mentor of mine. He is, in fact, on air. I am. There, yep, he is on the air with us. And we wanted to talk a bit about the relationship between Scotch whiskey and Irish whiskey. Yes. But I wanted to kind of get into your background because when we thought of doing this comparative series between Scotch and other iconic global whiskey styles, you were the guy that I thought of immediately for the Irish thing, because you were one of the original masters of Scotch in the Diageo education advocacy program, but you also worked for Diageo in Ireland.
I did.
A year, yeah.
2 years. Yeah. 2 years. I worked
2 years.
At Guinness. I did. I did.
So,
and,
yeah.
I have a slight bit of a brogue. I did.
Yeah, I noticed that. That's fantastic. What's really cool about the angle that I have on you currently is that your beard runs right into your t-shirt. It's really hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. So
it's actually a hair shirt. It's a hair shirt.
I was going to say I was quite impressed. I was quite impressed.
My beard just runs right into my chest hair. That's what it does.
You just made a shirt out of it. You just wore a shirt.
I just shaved this.
It's a onesie, if you will.
You don't want to know where it stops. Okay? That's all I'm saying.
We don't. Our viewership may be interested.
I'm legally not allowed to run through the woods of Washington State.
Oh, right on. Because that would just throw everybody.
I think I saw you on my hike last week. Actually, I'm pretty sure.
Was I making weird howling noises?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Guilty. The thing I do in the woods, it's just a thing. What are you gonna do?
Hey, Satchwatch.
So I had mentioned you were the first guy that I met in my booze career who had made a career out of whiskey education and advocacy, and I didn't even know that was a job until I met you.
Well, actually, it wasn't a job until I met you. No, it wasn't a job until they made the Masters of Whiskey. We were originally the Masters of Scotch, or Diageo, and then they started adding Bullet and Crown Royal, and then Diageo had bought Bushmills off of Pernod Ricard at the time, and then there was the Master of Whiskey. But there were no brand ambassadors here in the U.S. There were. They were sending guys over, former distillers over from Scotland, but all those guys had retired like in the early 90s, and by the early aughts, they're all in their 70s. So young bucks.
And the fellow that you learned from, that you and that initial group learned from, the distiller emeritus for the classic malts, the dearly departed Evan Katnack, he's really the fellow that kind of invented all of our jobs.
Really did.
Which, thank goodness for that, because I like having a job, particularly one that I get to ramble on incessantly about whiskey.
It really is. I mean, think about it. I mean, I know people come up to you guys now and probably go, "Oh my God, how did I get your job?" I mean, all you guys do is stand in front of people, drink whiskey, and talk about it. And when you think about it,
hey, I'll use that voice too.
Perfect.
I just hope the companies never hear them say that and they'll realize, we're paying these guys.
Right.
All right. Right. Can we edit that out, Dan? Let's edit that out.
Take two.
Exactly. Yeah.
But, so when I met you, it was the sort of an eye-opening experience for me in terms of, wow, this could actually be a career, and then to see where you took it and to end up in Ireland, talking to people about. At that point, you were still talking about the Walker and the classic malts of Scotland, but just to people in Ireland, right?
Well, kinda. I mean, Scotch was not a huge. It's so weird to think of it. I mean, when you think of Scotland and Ireland, basically, Isla's 18 miles off the coast of Northern Ireland. I mean, it's a hop, skip, and jump. And on a clear day, you can see it. There's Isla on the Giant's Causeway. But the whiskey really hadn't come over. Maybe in Northern Ireland, Belfast, and the hotels, but that was really for the tourists. It wasn't for the locals. So my job actually, and I was really looking forward to it because I thought, I think we had Bushmills for maybe 3 or 4 years. We had just celebrated the 400th anniversary of Bushmills in Chicago, which is where I'm located. Big thing. We had brought Cullen Egan, the master distiller, over, and had 400 people hold little fake candles in the field, and we brought a bagpipe troupe out and all this stuff. And then I go to Ireland a few months later, moved to Ireland, and the actual date, which I believe was April 26th. The signing of the license to distill back in 1608, and I'm looking around the office. I go, guys, we doing anything special this weekend? And I go, well, why? What are you talking about? And 1608, you got the distillery. No. In fact, Bushmills just closed for the day, and they had like a little company picnic. That was it. There was no big thing for it, and it took. I was there almost 2 years, and it really took about a year and a half to really get any kind of program together where I was going around talking to people about Bushmills, right? Really trying to push it, and it was weird. You go down into Cork, which is Middleton territory, and here I am doing a whiskey tasting in a pub with the Proddy whiskey, as they would call it, and I'm down there in Republican land, and hoping that my Yank credentials would eliminate me from being blown up.
Right, and it did clearly. You made it out in one piece.
Survived.
I'm impervious to explosions, as it turns out.
So, good.
So just a quick question as well for you. When you originally went over, before you got the programming in place that allowed you to narrowly avoid or walk through car bombs, it sounds like.
Good.
Right. What was your title moving over? What were the responsibilities of your job when you originally were slated to go over?
That's funny you mentioned, because there really weren't any responsibilities. They had no brand ambassador. The whole concept. All they knew is that some accounts especially in Dublin, but in other parts, especially Belfast and down in Cork City, were really getting into the whole cocktail scene. And when I say cocktails, we're talking mojitos and cosmopolitans, and very, very, a lot of them pretty basic. Though a lot of them were adopting a lot of mixology skills. That's actually the first place I heard of mixology, mainly because of Jack McGarry and Sean Muldoon from the Merchant up in Belfast. But even when we started the Masters of Whiskey, they hired us in December, brought us over to Scotland for the Malt Advocate course. We were supposed to start January 2nd that following year, and I said, "Well, okay, you taught us about whiskey. What am I supposed to do?" And they go, "Just make it up. Go out there and do, And luckily, I had one woman, a great gal, Rachel Moorhead, who you knew, Dan. She was it was Shefflin Somerset at that point. She was my contact there, and she just called up the local distributor and said, "I want to see Marty out in the market 3 to 4 times a week for a month." And that kind of got me started. You talk to places, a lot of places were really hungry for whiskey tastings, because again, the only ones who ever did that was when you did get some guys coming over from Scotland. Again, for Glenmorangie, you had Anthony Burnett, and he only came over, that was it. Him and Evan were the only 2 guys I ever knew in my bartending career, which spanned the 90s.
Okay.
Anyone who came over and talked to you about whiskey, that was it. So the same, you go over to Dublin, they had at one point to go into a little meeting to know how to make a Moscow Mule. And I just said, well, just put in vodka and ginger. They didn't know what ginger beer was. They had ginger ale. It's easier to get, and lime. And they said, "Would you put the lime in first, then the vodka? Wait, how do you do that? Wait, hey, could you show us?" I go, "It's not putting together a bomb." Which I could show you how to do that because I'm impervious to them. But there were no. And my title was, I was the Reserve Brand Ambassador for Diageo Ireland.
Oh, okay, right. So it expanded beyond Bushmills. You had that whole reserve portfolio.
Ciroc vodka, yes, Tanqueray. It wasn't huge over there. Again, it was still a small group. I tried to get a Bullet over there because I saw that bourbon was catching on, but at the time, I think you had to bring in 6,000 cases. to a market for a brand like that, and there were only 10,000 bars in all of Ireland.
Right.
So yeah, that would have been, a lot of those bars weren't really selling. I mean, I wanted specifically a few.
Right. But I mean, asking them to take a case on of a thing that they had really no track record.
No idea of.
Not going to really work that well. So you, over the course of your experience over there, you worked fairly closely with Colm Egan. You just mentioned him previously, master distiller at Bushmills. And Cam and I were talking a little bit earlier about the convergent and then divergent paths of the evolution of Scotch whiskey and Irish whiskey. In your experience over there, having a background in Scotch whiskey, but this practical experience in Irish whiskey, where do you see the sort of the substantive differences? You're trying to explain to somebody, okay, why are these two iconic whiskey styles? Why are they both important to know about and experience and drink? Where do you think those big pillars, in your mind, what are the big pillars of difference between them?
Well, I think you first start off with and it depends on who you talk to. In fact, Evan Kotnak I would say, hey, you're Scotch. Let's do the Irish, bringing the whiskey over, to Islay, which is kind of considered the birthplace of Scotch whiskey. I've heard it referred to it, and it's most likely that distilling, probably from the monks. Of course, all this is,
speculative.
Speculative. We don't know, and there's no facts. There was no shipping itinerary. 6 months that day.
But it makes sense. It does make sense.
It does. But then Evan just turned it around and said, well, how do you know that there weren't 6 monks on Islay that sailed over to Ireland? I go, cuz.
I just do.
I just do, guy, Mr. Distiller. I don't think you see my title. I'm a master of whiskey.
Exactly. And your last name's Duffy. What are you going to say? Come on now.
Which is from the word dub, which means black, which is Dublin was black water. But hello.
I didn't know that.
Martin Black. You can call me Martin Black.
I'm going to.
And dew, of course, is black in Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Anyways, so it's interesting. Fionn O'Connor. Are you guys familiar with Fionn?
I know that name, but I don't know.
He is a young fellow over in Ireland. Is a wealth of knowledge. This guy luckily he's on some kind of, I think, lifelong scholarship, some government scholarship there, where he just researches Irish whiskey, and he wrote a book called A Glass Apart, about the history of single pot still whiskey. And he was just talking about how Irish whiskey has become Scotch light in a lot of people's eyes. I think also too, if you look at the general public, most people think of Irish whiskey as Jameson, and I think of Jameson, not to besmirch some of their other expression, but the standard Jameson is kind of Miller Lite of Irish whiskey. It's very easy. It disappears if you pour it on ice or you add water to it, which you wouldn't see with even bottom shelf scotches. So I always thought Scotch evolved from Irish whiskey, but it evolved into its own being. And I think one of the big secrets, one of the big differences, and you guys have Ardbeg there. You have a heavily peated whiskey. How come? The Irish had to be using peat as a fuel. Anyone who's been through Ireland, it's not. It's not a huge. Yes, they have trees, but it's not like they have giant national forests all over the place and giant redwoods. They used peat as a fuel source. So why weren't they using it more often? There's some records, but why'd they get away from it? And the Scots, for the most part, still embrace it, even to the point where you got a lot of Highland whiskeys that have, were typically unpeated, and now they'll have peated expressions at least. I mean, it's really, it's funny. I don't know how. And again, too, the two of them, the two categories share so much in common as far as they're basically all made of the same materials, right? I mean, with bourbon, you can mix up the grains a bit. Irish, if you're making single pot still, yeah, you can. And actually, traditionally, single pot still whiskey had a lot more different grains in it. But
that's what I was reading about. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Ransom does an Irish pot still mash bill from the 1964 or 1864. I mean,
right on. Because that would have been what is that? Rye and oats. I want to say there were the use of rye and oats and unmalted barley, because malted barley was the one that was being taxed the most aggressively. So.
Yeah, and for me, that actually, when in combination, when you look at that through the lens of would utilization of peat been true to Irish whiskey style, for me, I'm like, it would also go to reason that the achievable parts per million, not that they were taking any sort of measurement back then, but theoretically would be higher than what we see in just malted barley like we're using at Ardbeg. That's something that I had discussed with Brendan, I think almost a year and a half ago, was how would peating other barley or other grain sources affect overall phenols, and he was like, it would be much higher.
Yeah, and it could have been just local tastes that. I mean, the Irish. You go to Ireland, a lot of the cocktails, and of course this might be a more modern comparison, but a lot of the cocktails tended to be very sweet, very much on the sweet side. I remember making a dirty martini for a group of young, some of my sales reps, and they just thought I was feeding them poison. I mean, they're thank you. I even made a margarita for my boss. We were at one bar, and I got behind the bar and made a margarita, put salt on the rim, and he was an English fellow. He go, "Oh, that's minky. Oh, well, that." I go, "Dude, you've never been to Mexico. You've never been to the States. Never had a margarita with salt in the rim." The ladies,
right?
Oddly enough, but he just
I love that. That's amazing.
And you wonder why the sun is set on the British Empire. That's why.
Exactly. So speaking of this, that's a really good point in terms
wonderful
of
transition, Dan. Love it.
So in terms of how the timing of the Irish declaring independence from the British Empire, it seems as though it wasn't particularly well timed. In terms of
what's that? Bad timing.
Yeah, just not
hindsight.
Not
2020 though. Like hindsight 2020.
It was like a couple of years later, they're all going,
that might not have been.
That was odd, wasn't it?
So it seems as though once independence was declared and the British markets were cut off to Ireland, that Ireland became even more aggressively isolationist. And one of the things that I was really surprised by is how aggressively they rejected any business that could have been done. Granted, it wasn't above board, but with bootleggers during U.S. Prohibition, because statistically before, by the mid-1900s, if you were drinking whiskey anywhere in the world, the odds were it was Irish.
Mm-hmm. In fact, yeah, go ahead. Well, I know the Irish whiskey at one point in the 1800s was outselling Scotch in Scotland. It outsold at least rye and possibly bourbon here in the U.S. And it's one of my theories is that now you always hear the story why the E and the B for whiskey. I always thought, it's thought that the Irish started really sticking with the E to differentiate itself from Scotch whiskey. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but I kind of like it. And then that the American whiskeys saw how popular Irish whiskey was, and so they stuck with E. Now, the use of EY actually predates all that. You can find in the records where, American whiskeys were spelling it with an E and without an E. And supposedly George Dickel spells his whiskey without an E because he thought it was as good as any Scotch, which is a little weird because I don't think Scotch was only really coming into the U.S. once it was blended. And that was after 1860. And it's still, I don't think it was still as, it still wasn't, and who knows? It might have had mainly because folks like Tommy Dewars and some of the Walkers, they were very wealthy, and when they were promoting it, they were promoting it big time. And so they could have been promoting Scotch to a higher class of people. And so George Dickel could have seen that and said, Scotch.
Yeah.
That's our market.
I had kind of chalked it up to being, and this may not be, I'm not a geography major or anything, but it seemed to me that the U.S. and Canada and Ireland and Scotland are super close to each other. So in order for both of those groups of countries to have a whiskey that differentiates itself from its essentially border neighbor, then that made a certain amount of sense. And everybody else around the world that had decided the SKY spelling, because we don't necessarily have a direct competitor on our border that we have to differentiate ourselves with, and the Canadians and their connection to the British Empire and all that kind of crap. But I mean, to your point, I think there may or may not be a definitive answer to the question why the EY in some cases and why not in other cases.
Well, I find it funny if you talk to different guys. We had Don Livermore on our little show, and he was talking about, and I never heard this, that Canadian whiskey got its big push during the Civil War, which but I don't know if his thinking was completely right, because he was saying they weren't going to take whiskey from the South, the Northerners during the Civil War. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, Kentucky was part of the Union. They fought on the side of the Union, and you already had whiskey distilleries still in Pennsylvania and in other northern states. So it's not like they were all. In fact, Illinois had a huge distilling community. Peoria.
I don't necessarily know how I would, if I agree with it. Yeah, because to your point, Kentucky, as well as Virginia, and Pennsylvania, all of these states were essentially part of the Union, and they were definitely iconic whiskey producing. I think
New York.
Yeah, exactly. New York rye, Pennsylvania style rye whiskey, So I don't think the Northerners were that. Sure, they could have been enjoying Canadian whiskey, but I always got the impression that, so once the perfect storm hit Ireland, and I don't even think they voluntarily became isolated. Thank you. I think it was mainly due to the fact that they got a little lazy. You had one of the biggest distilleries in the world was George Rowe, the George Rowe Distillery in Dublin. And they lost. The British Empire was 25% of the world at that time. That's how much that empire was. It was huge, and that's cut off. All right, you say, okay, well that's fine. We have the Yanks over there, and we'll just sell it to the Yanks. And then the Yanks decide they're going to have that little experiment in 1990, Prohibition, and that cuts that off. Well, and don't forget, Canada was part of the British Empire. Right. So that meant there was no Irish whiskey coming into Canada, and at least not legally. So you don't have that opportunity that Scotch and Canadian whiskey had to
sneak down through the borders. And it's funny, Don was saying he didn't believe Prohibition really helped. He thought it hurt Canadian whiskey. I go, I don't think so. Did you watch that documentary?
A live historical document, exactly. Because Sean Connery's from Chicago. Come on.
Yeah, with that thick Irish Scottish accent.
Nondescript brogue.
Yeah. He came from the very thick, big merging Irish Scottish immigrants.
Right, the Gallic town. Yeah, that part of Chicago. I've never been there.
You guys might have heard too that so during Prohibition there was a lot of I used to read about how a lot of gangsters, a lot of bootleggers, we'll call them, would take advantage of the popularity of Irish whiskey and just refill the bottles. And they could be refilling it with all sorts of crap, which would explain, this also comes out in another part I'll mention in a sec. But from family to family, from generation to generation, how, people would say, oh, Irish whiskey, ooh, oh, I can't have that. That's too strong for me. That's too tough. And they go, what? Irish whiskey is the pussycat that and Canadian whiskey are the two pussycats of whiskey.
Truly.
That's what Jameson is growing by leaps and bounds because college kids can do shots of it and think they're having really, my hair shirt is getting even bigger and blurrier. But it's not, it's it's the same thing again when I used to sell Bushmills here in Chicago and other places, including one time at a hotel down in County Kerry. You get the whole, I can't have that. It's Protestant whiskey. Protestant whiskey. It's 400 years old. It was there before the Protestants were there. You dingleberry. What do you want?
I guess, and I am surprised that was still a thing. I mean, I had gotten told sort of progressively over the course of, because I was on the distributor side when we met. I was on the distributor side and dealing with Bushmills, and the classic malts and all that stuff. But we had kind of downplayed the idea. The Catholics versus Protestants thing, it's in Ireland, that's not really a deal. Apparently it is. Still, is it still a deal?
No, the guy who said that was French.
That's true. Actually, that is true. So.
Leave it to the French to not understand whiskey.
Get back over the channel right now, because I'm not going to save your butt twice in 1 century, or when we're the 100 3 times, actually.
Right.
But I would always hear it from, at least here in the U.S., and some of the other ambassadors talk about it. It was always the same thing. Someone would say, yeah, my grandmother would kill me if I had that.
Wow.
What? Really? Is your grandmother from Ireland? Because the thing in Ireland itself, at that point when I was over there, it was 2008 to 2010, they wanted to forget all that crap. That was bad mojo, and they just didn't want to, to bring that up was
right.
Now you could always bash the English. That was always fun.
That's an easy target. Yeah.
Yeah, but in a nice way. I mean, not
punching down, really punching down.
Yeah. No, they're always outnumbered. There'd be a couple.
Exactly. There's only a dozen of them.
Yeah, not even. It'd be like 1 or 2 and just point them out.
Couldn't even beat their colonies. Like, come on.
Yeah, especially, exactly. Well, that's why I always give the Irish and the Scots shit for us. Dude, we did over 200 years ago. You guys, Scotland, you can't even vote yourself up free? Come on. Come over here.
Yeah, we've got a book we could probably loan you on the subject or something.
Some paint half my face blue and scream really loud.
I think that you could be the ambassador to Irish uprisings. Is my thing.
Chicken Heart would be my name.
Chicken Heart. Oh, I love it. That'd be great. So one of the things that it occurred to me, researching this, but also in just digging through some of the back catalog of the history of the development of Irish whiskey as a thing versus the development of Scotch whiskey as a thing. It seems as though the advent of the column still provided another one of those forks in the road that one could either go down or not go down. And it seems as though the Irish decided that they didn't want to go down that road. And that feels like one of the underpinnings of why Irish whiskey structurally, in terms of its the production concept, not necessarily, now these days, what's happening in terms of how Jameson is produced and that sort of thing. But in the formative years after the advent of the continuous still, it seems the Irish didn't take the bait.
I think some of that is, again, going back to Braveheart, history is written by the winners. And I think there's a lot of, misinformation about that. I think there were a lot of distilleries that did start using the column still, but they weren't big guys. And so the big guys, you ever read that book, The Truth, I think it's called The Truth of Truth. Written, I think it was commissioned by Jameson and a couple of the big guys because they were fighting against it. They didn't want it. Why? Because that's not what they were making at the time. And you look at Scotch whiskey, you're drinking Ardbeg. Ardbeg, even back in the 90s, and when I first started working for Johnny Walker in the classic malts was about 96, and trying to sample out Talisker and Lagavulin to people, they were either awed by it, going, "Oh my God, well, my mouth is full of smoke. What's happening? I'm on fire." Or they go, "Oh, it's like an ashtray." Lagavulin, I think, was only open like 4 days a week, 9 to 5.
Wow.
Because most of their whiskey was being used in some blends, mainly White Horse, but a huge seller at that point. I mean, it was at one point, it was a big, huge brand. Probably maybe going into some of the Walkers. But Talisker was a workhorse for the Johnny Walkers. Red and black. Talisker still is a staple. But up until recent history, and it's funny when you go on some of these Scotch groups and you hear them all talking about this, and go, I've been a Scotch drinker a long time. Yeah, since 2014. Yeah. Way back. And I go, that's not a long time. 6 years ago.
Right.
I got underwear that old. But the Scotch whiskey back then, it was still I think, especially when it came to the common folk, it was, and especially single malt. Look at single malts, man. Single malts, let's see, you had some coming in, supposedly Lefroy was coming in during Prohibition, but under the heading of medicine for medicinal purposes.
Sure.
But it wasn't really until Glenlivet and Glenfiddich came in the early 60s. So roughly as long as I've been alive. Then you had Macallan is what really kind of took single malt to the next level, and that wasn't until the 80s. I mean, that was right in the mid-80s, I'm guessing. And then the classic malts came in about 1988, and that's where the whole idea of regions and regionality came about. And that was really more, some truth to it, but mostly marketing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So when you start talking about, all right, making single grain whiskey or column still whiskey and adding it, the Scots had a little more of a reason to glom onto that. Plus, they had a lot more distilleries that, could be blended together, that we're creating a very more diverse spectrum of flavors, which I still find amazing about Scotland.
Right.
Again, you bring it down to the fact that it's barley, yeast, water, thyme, and Mike Miller put it really well once upon a time. Mike Miller of Delilah's fame. He said if you're a bourbon drinker, you'll like most bourbons to varying degrees because there's a bourbon flavor to them. Scotches, there's scotches from the Speyside region that taste downright fruity.
Yep.
I'm not talking like juicy fruity or like it's grape juice or anything, but there's a real sweet fruity character to it, and then you have that dry, spicy, brainy whiskeys that may or may not even come from the island sometimes.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's a really good point.
I agree. That's one of the things that for me as a whiskey drinker, I latched onto. I was just like that the possible flavor universe in Scotch whiskey was as diverse as the topography. So that makes it a very attractive category for that reason. You said something that was incredibly interesting to me, that made me think I actually just have no point of reference for this. So I wanted to ask you, at its height, at the height of, Irish whiskey distilling, how many active distilleries would there realistically have been, for there to be, blended Irish whiskeys that were sourced from?
Well, the big mothership, and this is something that I don't think a lot of people realize, Jameson was kind of the MGP of its day. There was a lot of folks were sourcing whiskey from there, and I believe, if I am not mistaken, the Jameson brand, the Jameson we all know, it really didn't come into being until the 60s. So you had that producing how many distilleries? If you look through the timelines, because Ireland, bless its little heart, it's gone through so many horrible things over the last, even just the 200 years, but boy, go back even further. Especially, the other thing is I'm a bit of an Anglophile. I do love I meet a British person, I automatically think their IQ is about 50 points higher than my own. But they were, they've so much of what they did to Ireland affected not only the people, its history, but whiskey production, as Dan mentioned about the taxation and malt the barley, but then the famine, a bunch of different, famine, you think about the famine, you had a bunch of distilleries before the famine, and it might have been, I think at one time it was around that time there have been about 90 legal distilleries. The other thing to keep in mind that there's loads, even today, there are a bunch of little stills sprinkled throughout Ireland that aren't necessarily legal. But they, the famine not only killed about 1 million people, but another million and a half left. So your own home market was depleted as far as potential consumers. And then I think by the early 19th, population of Ireland had gone down from 8 million to only about 2 million. And compare that to the fact that Glasnevin Cemetery on the north side of Dublin has about 2 million people buried there. So, many people buried in that cemetery as you had actually walking around.
Actually living.
Yeah. That's wild. Jesus.
It's back up there now. It's about 5. I think it's about 5.5 million. And they get about, COVID, they're getting about 10 million tourists, which was helping them quite a bit. Anyway, before the big perfect storm, they may have had close to 200 distilleries. But after Prohibition was repealed, it was down to, I want to say, 5 in the Republic. You had Middleton, you had Powers, you had Jameson. So it was Jameson was up in Dublin. You had Locke, and you had Tullamore-Dew. Mm-hmm. But in the next 20 years, Tullamore-Dew and Locke went on. Powers and Jameson joined forces. Tullamore-Dew, the brand, was bought up by Powers. Powers and Jameson joined in with Middleton to form Irish distillers. And then up in the north, you had Bushmills and Coleraine, but Coleraine went under, and then eventually Bushmills was purchased by Pernod Ricard too. So at one point, everything was owned by the French, and you had only 2 distilleries on the whole island.
Wow.
One north and the south. So it almost disappeared.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and if you look at that in terms of what happened with the reformation of Scottish taxation and the bringing out of the sort of the darkness and into the light in terms of illegal distilling to legal distilling, the Scottish government, eventually the British government, working not always seamlessly, but eventually to get to a point where you could pay your taxes, own your license, and distill at a profit. It seemed like by the time that could have begun to take root in Ireland, they declared their independence, for one thing. And so even though Scotland's distilling capacity, the numbers of distilleries, has ebbed and flowed throughout, it never got there. And it feels like now that Ireland and Irish whiskey, and to love it or hate it, what Jameson has done to raise the public profile around the world of Irish whiskey, it feels like what's happening now in Ireland is what happened, say, in kind of now in Scotland too, but really in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, the massive growth in Scottish whiskey investment happened again in the 60s. That stuff never happened in Ireland, but it seems to be happening now. It's a really interesting thing how rapidly the numbers of distilleries in Ireland is growing, the rapidity at which the rate of Irish whiskey is being consumed around the world. What do you make of that? I mean, why? I understand why it took this long, but what do you think the appeal is? Why do you think it's so hot now?
Well, I think, again, I think Scotch to a certain degree. I don't want to say it's played itself out, but people are really, really familiar with it. Right. And it's another Scotch coming on the line. And also, too, I would say in the last 10 years, is it the last 10 years that, when I was working at Diageo, and I left in the end of 2010, I want to say there was about 95 distilleries. Now, isn't there about 155? In
Scotland, right around that number. Yeah, the number of distilleries is exploding as well.
Yeah, and then down in England too. I think there's.
Oh right,
yeah, England's going crazy.
Whereas in Ireland, even now, even though it seems like it's exploding, you really only have 20 distilleries, I think, that are actually online. Okay. Another 30 that are either being built or in the planning stage. And they've had a number of distilleries fall through. A lot of Irish, you only have a handful of the new distilleries, less than probably a handful of the new distilleries that actually have whiskey that's more than 3 years old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a super good point.
I mean, Teeling had a bunch of whiskey out, but they were sourcing most of their whiskey was old Bushmills or old Cooley distillery whiskey. Yeah. And only their own whiskey has come out, I think, the end of 2019.
Okay.
Whiskey first started coming out. or it might have been 2018, maybe 2018. Dingle, they have stuff out.
Slane as well.
Yeah, well, Slane's. I don't think that's their whiskey. That's not their.
Okay.
Yeah,
it's a brand, but
yeah, it's sourced.
Okay.
Because I don't think that distillery hasn't been up for 3 years. It has to be 3 years for it to be Irish whiskey. Blackwater, Peter Mulryan's stuff. And if anyone wants to know more about Irish whiskey, Peter Mulryan was a broadcaster and then wrote a number of books about Irish whiskey before starting his own distillery. His blogs on his distillery website are fascinating. Dan, you'd eat it up because he goes into a lot of what, again, with the big guys. In fact, this goes back to your whole thing about column still whiskey and how the big boys kind of dictate stuff. They have an Irish whiskey board now, but who's on it? Pernod Ricard.
Yeah.
The big boy, they're the constant big boy over there. And so they've put out what a single pot still whiskey should be like, this is what qualifies. Well, what do you think they wrote? It's basically Redbreast, their product, and so it's, everyone else is going, Peter and Fiona and O'Connor are saying, well, wait a minute, historically, that's not right. That's not single pot still whiskey. And now everybody just has to recreate your whiskey? No. So they're going through some birthing pains, some growing pains over there. Again, the other thing to keep in mind when you see this great growth in Irish whiskey is that a huge percentage of it is Jameson.
Right.
And then another big chunk would be, I think Bushmills and Tullamore-Dew are keep on going back and forth for the number 2 spot worldwide. That's the lion's share of that whiskey that's out there. You have some like Glendalough and as far as brands go, Glendalough and what would be another one? Hyde.
Oh yeah.
Whiskey,
and of course, Mark Renné's new thing. And there's no real numbers behind it because it's so new, but there's a lot of buzz behind it. Behind Waterford,
a lot of buzz behind them. Yeah.
So I haven't had it.
The only problem with a lot of buzz is every time you get this buzz, who's actually drinking it? Who is getting it? And also too, with the problem with small guys, and it's not their fault. It's just that they're small, so therefore. The price tag on those bottles are going to be high, and that's tough to compete against someone like Jameson who can. Well, how much is a bottle of regular JMO? Is it still under $20?
You can get a handle of it for what you'd pay for a $750 of somebody else's.
Exactly.
And that's to your point, that drives so much growth. Mostly, it's a bit like I think what happened between Patron and tequila. Jameson is sort of Kleenex of that category, as Patron for many years was. I feel the same way about both of those brands. It's like you want to, but at the same time, they drove so much volume for the category and opened up a lot of people's minds to the idea that super premium tequila is a viable thing in the U.S. That Irish whiskey that could make after a century and a half could be making the kind of comeback that Irish whiskey, the sort of dominance that Irish whiskey had in the U.S. before. Whether the trickle down to the other brands, it takes a while. But each of those brands are shot occasion brands. Nobody's shooting Glenmorangie. That's Dan, just not going to happen.
No, I do.
Dan, that's a really great kind of pairing of spirits right there. To take a look at kind of comparatively in that regard, because I think they both also in addition to being handily their category leaders, and the genesis point for a lot of people to kind of dive into the categories. I do also believe that they've as times have kind of gone on, they've evolved to now offer marks that are, I guess, more traditional, and then also some marks that are a little bit more kind of esoteric and experimental as well. At the exact same time, they've kind of grown in both directions at the exact same time. So I think that's absolutely a great. I mean, you have the Jameson's like cask mates, whatever program that is, and then you have for Patron, you had them exploring coffee liqueur, and then now also doing like Tahona milled product, which is very artisanal and historical. So I can see them both kind of moving in a similar way. I appreciate that reference.
Well, and both those brands have courted bartenders aggressively, super aggressive. I'm not sure that there are brands. I'm sure there are, but in terms of brands that have consistently gone after and tried to win share of mind in the bartending community, certainly Jameson and Patron are right up there, which leads me to my next question for you, Marty. The expansion of Irish whiskey distilling in terms of new distilleries coming online, and the expansion of Irish whiskey as a category, since that relied so much on introduction in the on-premise, what happens to Irish whiskey as a result of COVID?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, that could also apply to just about so many other categories and brands. Totally. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think even about U.S. craft distilleries.
Oh, geez, yeah.
Some of them, it's funny. Well, it's interesting. So let me use an American distillery. I will not name it, but one U.S. distillery I know of was actually kind of hurting because they kind of put all their eggs in the on-premise, and they were doing great. They were doing gangbusters. It was great. They were doing pretty well in the off-premise, but on-premise, woo, cocktails, everything else, nice affordable whiskey, some good rye. People loved it. Now COVID comes around, hurting them. Other guys who did the exact opposite and focused more, because it was much easier, obviously, to get into big retail spaces than try to get, especially on a drink menu, but even on a back bar. Yeah. Now they're hurting. They're hurting a little. They rely a lot on their tourist dollars, and they rely a lot on key accounts on the on-premise. But at the same time, in some of their general markets, like Great Lakes Distillery in Milwaukee does very well with their products locally. They're doing great. Plus, people can still go in there and buy it straight from the distillery if they like. Oh. In Ireland, big problem there. One, again, there's not a lot of tourists coming, if any. Plus, I mean, they've been on a severe lockdown most of this time, so probably no tourists. That was a big money draw for some, like Tonic Distillery in Mayo. I do not believe they might have had a vodka or a gin out. I don't know if it ever came over here yet, but their thing was they were laying their whiskey down, and they weren't sourcing any that I knew of. So they're relying on tourist dollars. So that's the big hurt. Once this all, I mean, the whole COVID question, how things all fall into play once this thing is all done. I mean, it's going to be, on one, it's already tragic because there's so many places that we know of that have shuttered their doors for good.
For good. Yep.
Fountainhead here in Chicago shuttered their doors, man.
It just hurts.
Delilah's still not open. And, I don't know how long Mike can keep that up. So that's the other question, is that, when this all lightens up, if it does ever, whatever, whoever decides these things, God, then will they have anyone to sell to in the on-premise?
How much culture was erased, and how long does it take to rebuild culture in that way? I was looking at a list of bars and restaurants in Denver alone that have permanently closed since March, and it just made me like fundamentally sad to read it, because it takes so long to establish a city's identity and its culture and its vibe, and so when a big chunk of its heart is ripped out. And that's an expensive place to be in the first place. Right. So reinvestment in the on-premise, because that's going to stay a speculative dollar spend for a while. I just don't know. I mean, we won't really know the direct impact culturally of what we've been through for a while, but I think we're going to find that it is absolutely devastating.
I think you can sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think you can already sense that some of your old favorite haunts just aren't going to be there.
No, they're just dropping.
Yeah,
and the staffs, and it's like Prohibition. All the talented bartenders moved. There's no place to move. They're going into other fields of they're going to get jobs.
Move to South Dakota. It's open up there. Just free range whiskey bars.
Here in Seattle, it has been, pretty interesting to see the response and see, bartenders posting on our, Washington State Bartender Guild page, like shifts that they're working at places that are not, essentially not food service or beverage service, bars or restaurants. Like one comes to mind of a young bartender. She ended up posting that she works at a gun range over in Bellevue on Thursdays, Fridays, and Sunday nights. And I was like, well, I'm going shooting on Sunday nights now.
Okay, she's not serving drinks at the gun range.
No, not serving drinks.
That's just at the axe throwing place where they serve the drinks.
Exactly.
Let me throw a question at you guys. Now, this is something I saw briefly, but I just avoid these pages, especially on Facebook. You get invited to a lot of these whiskey groups, and I love them, but sometimes they're a little weird. When they post a picture of their bottle of whiskey and their Winchester rifle.
Exactly. Like those will go together. That'll end well.
44. And they talk about it and go, I don't get it. I hope you're going to the gun range first, then drink.
There's an order there that you really need to follow.
Not so much when you're making that Moscow Mule that you told us about at the top of the show, but when you're drinking and using firearms.
Willy-nilly, but unfortunately, you might have to, on the back of that Ardbeg bottle, you might have to have little merchants.
Exactly.
After a trip to
That's a good point. We've run past our hour, so golly, thanks, Marty. This was a lot of fun. I knew it would be, because you're a guest to hang out with and chat with. I knew that you'd not only had background on the Diageo portfolio, but Scotch in general. You'd worked on the Glenmorangie portfolio. You worked on Ardbeg. You worked in Ireland, and now you're the prognosticator of these lovely items, which is really great. But we're honored that you spent your afternoon with us, and we're going to continue Islands to Islands in 2021. It'll probably be bi-weekly as opposed to weekly, but we'd love to have you on again at some point to chat about literally anything you'd like to talk about.
Oh, good. Yeah, because I have some new stag films I'm going to be watching.
Great. Oh, yeah. That's perfect.
Those, maybe show a few.
We haven't done that episode yet.
They're vintage. They're all vintage. So.
Well then, we're all about the vintage stuff. That's what we just do an episode strictly on vintage things.
To your point, real quick though, Dan. I mean, so you mentioned what is the path to market for a lot of these brands, and you've been seeing it over the last couple of months with shows like this. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've had a number of people from we had Peter Mulryan on our show, and Luis McGuane from Chapelgate. whiskey company in County Cork.
Nice.
And we plan on having a few more, whoever we can get. Cullen Megan, I know I'm like Cullen Megan light, even though I'm heavier than he is, but I'm the guy. Actually,
you're the guy.
A good guy for you guys to have on about Irish whiskey is not only Fiona and Cat.
My cat. Oh, by the way, I did post both those books in the comments. The books you'd mentioned, the Peter O'Ryan book and the Glass Apart.
Great book.
Which I need both of those books right away.
And then it's shows like this that would be perfect for those guys. So yeah, if you have a chance to reach out to a lot of those distillers, because also their stories are fascinating. And also, if you can find the guys before their brands are bought up by the big boys, like Slane, Brown Foreman, you got Bacardi's Teeth and the Teeling Boys, you got Proximo has Bushmills.
Right. Yeah, exactly right. So yeah, we'll have to make hay while that particular sun is still shining, which would be good. Cameron and I both will be moving into probably the second half of 2021 and spending a whole lot of time in Chicago. So we will come and find you and hoist a dram with you.
I beckon
as soon as. Thank you. Thanks for that. That's awesome. So you are on Instagram at Dances with Wolves, which I love. Cam is Ardbeg Cam on Instagram. His show is Mondays and Fridays. I think it's still Mondays and Fridays. Yeah,
Mondays and Fridays for right now until the new year, and then we'll be switching over to Wednesdays. Random day, middle of the week.
Very nice. So that's Whiskey Through Food, which is a terrific show.
Hard pivot.
And so, Marty, what's your show with Lou?
Mr. Lou Bryson, whiskey scribe, and whiskey distiller whiz, Liz Rhodes.
Nice. Oh yeah, she's amazing. Yeah. She's terrific. I've caught that show a number of times, and she's wow. She's incredible. So that show is Tuesdays, right before ours. It's. Okay, yes. Perfect. So great.
Noon Central Time, and when Liz talks, just watch my face because I'm just trying to figure out the words she's using.
Listen, lady, just take it easy on me, okay?
Is that a $10 word? Listen, mister.
So yeah, that's a great show. I've tuned in a number of times. We had Lou on this show; he was amazing. So we'll have you on again in 2021. We'll come and see you in Chicago and hoist a dram or 5 or 9 in honoration and with full responsibility, like adults drink.
Absolutely.
Come here to Chateau Duffy. Have lots of whiskey, including a lot of old Ardbeg and Glenmo from my days. I think I opened bottles from those eras.
My very first Glenmorangie computer bag, which I carried for years, was the one that you gave me from your days.
Shipped to me by mistake. It was supposed to go to what was her name? Very sweet gal, English gal, blonde, really pretty.
Oh, Davinia Small. Davinia so her loss is
what a British name. Yes.
Exactly. Well, thanks, guys. This was a lot of fun. We'll see you online until this thing passes, and then we'll all meet in person at whatever whiskey bar is still standing in Chicago. At that point.
Meet again. Don't know when.
Thank you for that. Again, have a good afternoon. We'll talk to you guys again soon. Cam will be on next week talking Canadian whiskey at 2 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday.
Very exciting.
In the interim, everybody stay safe and healthy, and we'll meet again soon.
All right, Dan and Cam. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.
All right.